Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 41 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about the literal control in ASP.NET and the difference between literal and label controls. In my opinion, literal control is least understood in ASP.NET. In many ways, a literal control is very similar to a label control. Both of these controls are used to display the text on a web form, and the text property for these two controls can be either set in the HTML or in the code behind. Let's quickly look at an example. Let's drag and drop the label control onto the web form, and let's drag and drop a literal control also onto a web form. And as we discussed, both the text for both the controls, the text property can be set in the HTML as well as in the code behind. So we are setting now the text for the label control. If you look at this, label control has its text set in the HTML. Similarly for the literal control. Now obviously if we run this, as you might expect, the label will display its text and the literal control will display its text, okay, which is set in the HTML. Now let's say I want to set this in the code behind file. How do we do that? We use the text property of the label control and the text property of the literal control. Let's quickly do that. So on the page load, let's say for example I want to set the text of the label to label text, and similarly I want to set the text of the literal control to literal text. And obviously when we run this project, as you might expect, now we are setting the text in the code behind file, and obviously the label text and literal text is displayed. Label control wraps the text. This is one of the very important differences. Label control wraps the text in a span tag when rendered. So now the web form is rendered. If I right click on the page and view source, look at that. The text for the label that we have set, the ID of the label control is label 1. So the text of the label is actually wrapped inside a span tag. But look at the text of the literal control. This is displayed as is. It's not displayed using any surrounding tags. ASP.NET is not surrounding any tags around the literal text. Okay, so that's one of the very important differences. So label control wraps the text in a span tag when rendered. Any style. Now let's look at another thing. Let's close this and let's apply some styles to the label control. Let's close this one. Let's go here. Now if I want to apply a style to a label control, I can apply that. For example, let's say I want to bold the font, so I can say font bold is equal to true. And then similarly maybe I want to apply the color, so for color I want red, let's say. Okay, so we are applying styles to the label control. Now obviously, as you might expect, when we run this, when the text is displayed in the label control, it's bolded and in red color. And when we view the page source, you should see that the style that we have applied on the label control is actually applied to that span tag. So any style that is applied to the label control will be rendered using the style property of the span tag. A literal control doesn't output any surrounding tags, and we have just seen that the text is displayed as is. And let's say for example, if you're looking at right now, if you look at this one, the literal text doesn't have any styles applied to it. But is it possible to also bold this literal text and apply the red font to it? Absolutely. Now if we look at the literal control in the source, look at that. It doesn't have any properties like font bold, faux color, etc. The literal control is a much lightweight control than the label control. It doesn't have all these style properties. And another interesting thing is this label class also has CSS class property, but the literal control, it doesn't have all that. Okay, so if at all, if you want to apply any styles to the text of the literal control, you have to do that directly within the text. For example, let's say I want to bold the text, I can apply that here. So I directly apply the HTML tag myself. Okay, and similarly I want the font color to be red, so I'm saying font maybe color is equal to, obviously we have to escape that, and then close the font tag. Okay, so now when I run this, as you might expect, the literal text will be bolded and the color of the font will be red. So obviously now if you right click that and view page source, look at that, I get the text as is, the bold tag, the font that we have applied in the code behind file, and the actual text. And notice that still we don't have any other tag surrounding that literal text. But whereas the label text is surrounded by the span tag, and the styles that we have specified for the label control, the font, bold, and faux color, they are actually applied as styles for the span control. So to apply styles to a literal control, include them in the text of the literal control. If you just want the text, so this is a big question that we have to ask ourselves. When do we use literal control over label control? Okay, if we just want the text to be displayed without applying any styles whatsoever, then we use literal control. Otherwise, use the label control. By default, this is another interesting point to keep in mind. By default, both the label and literal controls does not encode the text they display. Let's understand what we mean by this. This is very important, in fact. Let's get rid of this text that we have in the HTML, in the code behind file. Let's flip to the HTML source. Now what I want to do basically is this label control has the text property. So I'm setting the text to something like this. I'm including a script tag. Look at this, script, and then I'm saying alert. We are using this JavaScript function alert, and let's call this label text. Okay, and then I am closing the script tag. Basically, if you look at this one, we are injecting the JavaScript into the text property of this label control. Alright, now let's do the same thing for the literal control. So let's copy that. Let's get to the literal control. We know that the literal control also has the text property. So text is equal to, I'm setting the same thing to this one. Now look at this. We are injecting JavaScript into the text properties of the literal and label controls. Now let's run this and see what's going to happen. And this is very dangerous. So if I run this now, instead of displaying that as text, the JavaScript will be interpreted and executed by the browser. Look at that. I get a JavaScript alert. Label text, I click OK. Again, I get label text, I click OK. That's because we have specified, to alert this message onto the browser window using this script tag. Let's change this to literal control so it makes sense. Okay, so the reason why, though you have set this as a text property of the label control and the literal control, it's since it's not HTML encoding this, it's interpreting that and then executing this JavaScript. Okay, so we don't want that. We want this to be encoded and displayed as a text in the label control and the literal control. So how do we encode the text? We do it slightly different for the label control and the literal control. If we want to encode the text for the label control, there is this server.html encode method. Let's look at that. So the text property, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this text from there. And then within the opening and closing braces of the label control, angle brackets percentage equals. So I can use the methods, the code behind methods. Server dot, there's a method called HTML encode. And if you look at this method, it expects a string. Whatever string you pass into this method, it's going to encode, HTML encode that string for us. So what I want to encode is this one. That's it. And if I want to encode the text of the literal control, all you have to do is the literal control supports a property called mode, and all you have to select here is encode. So what this literal control is going to do, whatever text that it's displaying, that will be HTML encoded once you set this property to encode. So now when we run this, as you might expect, the text will be displayed as is rather than interpreting it as a script and then executing it. Look at that. I get the script. I get it as it is. Whatever we have specified, that's displayed as is. So to HTML encode, the label text server.html encode method can be used, and for literal control, the mode property can be used. And literal control is a much lightweight control when we compare that with the label control. And if you look at the class hierarchy, the literal control, as we said, it's a much lighter weight control. So if you look at this, the class hierarchy for literal control inherits from control, which in turn inherits from system.object. But whereas label control, inherits from web control, which in turn inherits from control and system.object. And to quickly verify this for yourself, what you can do is in the code behind, we know that all these controls are in fact classes. So label control is actually a class. So if I right click on the label class and then go to definition, label class is inheriting from web control. If I right click on the web control, go to definition, web control is inheriting from control. And if I right click on that and go to definition, this control class inherits from system.object. You can't see it here, but all classes, we know that directly or indirectly inherit from system.object. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.